Greetings, I'm Adam Rentis, Director of IYC. In June of 1924, what we now call the International Youth Convention of the Church of God was just beginning to take shape. For the first time in our history, there was an entire day of Anderson camp meeting devoted to young people. Back then, it was called the Convention Youth Day. Throughout the next few years, this dedicated day continued until it was decided that one day was not enough, and the concept of a Church of God Youth Convention was born. Now, while this convention has experienced several changes over the past century, the primary focus, goal, and foundation of IYC has not wavered. Young people gather to worship and honor Christ, and to be encouraged and challenged to live as His followers in a world desperately in need of His light and His love. As we prepare to celebrate 100 years of youth conventions within the Church of God, we recognize that the challenges that were facing the youth of 1924 are worlds apart from the ones facing youth today, and yet somehow not all that different. We invite you to join us in Orlando to celebrate and to be honest about who we are and where we've been, to honor those who have come before us, and to invest in the next generation as we set the tone for what the next 100 years of IYCs will be about. 1924 was the origin story for IYC. May 2024 be the origin story for the next generation of Christ followers who will proclaim the mighty acts of the Lord and celebrate the Lord's abundant goodness to the generations to come. Join us for IYC 2024 Origins.
Hi, this is Jim Lyon, and welcome to our town hall on this 29th day of February, leap year day. We're so glad you've joined us. I'm in our studio on the northeast side of the Indianapolis Metro at the offices of Church of God Ministries in Anderson, Indiana. And with me tonight, Eastern, is my brother Justin Brown.
Hello.
I say my brother. We're not related by blood, but in Jesus we are.
We look like twins.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure. No, I look like your father. That's what you want to say. Justin, you're a pastor. Where do you pastor?
I'm in southern Indiana, in Monroe City, Indiana.
Monroe City is in southern Indiana. So how far would that be from, let's say, Indianapolis?
About 2 hours.
2 hours drive.
Yes.
And Monroe City, and I already know the answer to the question, but I think it's important for people to know, it has how many restaurants and cafes?
In the city itself, zero.
So,
not a single one.
But you're hoping that
we can go to the gas station and get some food.
You have a gas station
We
where
do.
you can get snacks.
We can.
All right.
Or fried food.
But your church is one that I've been privileged to
Yes.
speak there. Thanks for the invitation. And it's a very substantial church. It's actually an anchor in the town, I think, right?
I think so.
You've got hundreds of people in the parish who are following Jesus, and you're the shepherd, and we're so proud to have you here today.
Thank you.
And Justin has joined me to represent a kind of pastoral voice as we open up our town hall. And at the town hall, we want to invite you also to ask questions. Tonight, we're going to have a particular focus in the terms of, we just want to open it up with some content and dialogue about what we call secure deeding, which is a really important subject that sounds like a sleeper to most people who are, maybe tuning in and thinking, what? That sounds so boring. But it actually is so important to the kingdom work. But we also want you to know that our question and answer time and so on is not limited just to secure deeding. Whatever the Lord has placed on your heart, our hope is to be able to just hear what you have to say in your question and to give you some response that is framed by the Scripture and our own understanding of Scripture here in the Church of God. But to start, secure deeding. Sometimes it's been called conditional deeding. Sometimes it's called safe deeding. But it has to do with one primary object, and that is to preserve Church of God assets for the movement of the Church of God. And why? Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the reality that, as many people in Church of God know, we have kind of an elastic system of structure, don't we?
Yes.
I mean, how many
Yep.
members do you have in your church? What would you say?
Well, look, each Sunday or
Yeah,
overall?
well, see,
Because we all know that's a different number.
Every pastor.
About 230 or so every
Members,
weekend.
that's what you would say. But you're qualifying that because we don't have membership in the conventional sense. If you were a pastor in the Church of the Nazarene, you could probably give me a number. We have 232 because you'd have a piece of paper where people signed up or they went through a process and so on. But our churches have always been predicated on, if you profess Jesus as Lord, you worship with us, it's the Lord who adds members to the church daily. We have that text in Acts. I mean, that's our history. And that's a great strength, isn't it? It makes us quite an open and welcoming fellowship. And that's part of the reason why the Church of God is an anomaly in American Christianity, because we are really standalone in having an historic high proportion of different communities and ethnicities in our churches, because even in the late 1800s, we were welcoming everyone. Nobody had to go through the membership class. Nobody had to be screened and scrubbed by people, and it made it accessible, for instance, to freed slaves who wouldn't find a home in some other churches because they maybe couldn't read, or maybe they just weren't attuned to the culture of the church, which was the gatekeeper of membership. So we are founded on a phenomenal truth. God adds members to the church. But when you turn that around a little bit, you think about owning property together. So your church has a building.
We do.
And it's a beautiful building too, let me just say.
It is.
It's a spectacular property, honestly. And how do you own that together? It's not in your name, is it?
It is not. Thank goodness.
You haven't tried to move. You don't want to mow the grass or
No.
But what we do is we organize, usually in a nonprofit corporation, or in some states, an association might be called, so we could own property together for the kingdom.
Yes.
So it's not owned by anybody. It's owned by some corporation that satisfies the legal requirements for property ownership. And because of our very kind of, by the world's measure, I say elastic or kind of porous definitions of membership, we have been vulnerable in a way that many other church groups have not been to people coming in who might have a different agenda than the movements. They might have a different theology even. And when they come in, if they just hang around for a while, pretty soon they can vote in the business meeting. Then they might vote their way over the way of the people who founded the church. You might think this process, which sometimes is called steeplejacking, when somebody comes in and takes over,
Yeah.
is old news. Oh, that doesn't happen anymore, does it? What do you think?
I think you got some stories.
I think yes. Because this is a real deal. In fact, just earlier today, talking to our legal counsel, I'll not name the place, but we have two churches of congregation of the Church of God, and they're merging together, and they have together called a pastor who's from outside the Church of God, and hey, we're come-outers, come on out, come out from other denominational schemes and join us. So that's all to the good, no harm, no foul there. But this pastor that's come in actually is working to move that church into another church family, into the Assembly of God. No problem with the Assembly of God, they're good folk. But the people who built the building, the people who have poured their lives into it, were dedicated to the movement of the Church of God. And even as that property is slipping out of the Church of God's grasp, not necessarily because anybody has thoughtfully considered it, but because the leader of the church, the new shepherd, has kind of had a draw there, it could be gone, except for what? Years ago, the congregations had secured their deeds. They had placed a clause in their deed that said, if this congregation ever leaves the Church of God, well, then the property actually will revert to the Church of God. It won't be able, you just can't walk away from it. So if you bring in 100 people or 1,000 people, you are not going to be able to take the property with you if you want to go somewhere else and turn it into a Hindu temple. That sounds extreme, but usually into a different kind of theological stream. And that's
Right.
what secure deeding is like. Could you guess, just make a guess, Justin, how many millions of dollars do you think the Church of God has lost by properties that were taken out of the movement. The church, they didn't close. They just got new leadership. Or maybe even, in one case I can think of, a Church of God pastor who changed his theology
Right.
and decided to lead the group out. How many millions of dollars would you say?
Well, I'd say tens of millions at least.
That's right, just in the last couple of years. Just in the last couple of years. Because the properties were not securely deeded. And you might think, well, that could never happen in my church. Well, I know some people in the churches I've just referred to with millions of dollars walking the door who are Church of God, true and blue, and they loved Jesus, and they found Jesus in the Church of God, and they poured their lives and their energy into the Church of God. And now are standing on the curb grieving the fact that they're no longer in a place to even have voice in the ministry that they had built. So this brings us to secure deeding. It's not yesterday's news. It's still today's news. And we hope that you will consider this as we talk about a little bit. Now, your church in Monroe City
Yes.
it has just kind of a clean deed, what I'll say, a deed that does not have any conditions in it.
Correct.
It's not a secure deeding thing. And of course, your church has a long history. And how long have you been there pastoring?
It'll be 4 years in July.
Okay, so 4 years out of a long, this congregation's been there for decades and decades.
Yes.
So, and we're not here to persuade anybody that you need to do this or do that, but we just want to be sure that you understand what the questions are and what the correct answers are. So for instance, you haven't been at the congregation through all of its years of this issue, if it's come up every now and then, but can you just think of a reason why a local church might say, no, I don't think secure deeding's for us?
Well, I mean, I don't think it would upset anybody at the church to say it, but I know one of the hesitancies at the church that we're at in Monroe City is that there's the whole autonomy thing. That, okay, if we conditionally deed over, are we giving away some of who we are as Monroe City to Anderson, to Indiana Ministries, to whoever we conditionally deed to? Do we still get to be us?
Yeah.
Or is it one of those where every time we make a decision, they come in and say, no, we own your building. And you can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Or we're on your building's deed. You can't do that anymore.
I totally
I know that's one of the concerns.
And I think that's a concern not just in Monroe City. And it's reasonable. I mean, honestly, what do you think about fiddling with your deed and you put somebody else's name in it that's not your local church? There's that ordinary and reasonable caution and fear that, well, maybe that's just a step too far. And we in American culture especially are accustomed to autonomy. I mean, it's not just our church culture, it's American culture. Don't tread on me, so to speak. And so local control, all of that makes sense. What I would suggest though, and to anyone listening, is you just have to calculate your risks, because every choice you make comes with some risks. So do you risk losing your church if it's conditionally deeded, versus keeping it away from any kind of conditional or secure deeding process? Well, there's always a risk, I suppose. But the risks in secure deeding are very, very small. Why? Because every local church is the master of its own destiny. That is a foundation block of Church of God theology. I've been a Church of God pastor for 42 years at just two congregations, one 20 years in Seattle, the other 22 years here in Anderson. And I have been invited during those years by some of my brothers and sisters in other parts of the church family that have much more, what should we say, defined denominational boundaries. Hey, we need you, come on, we love the way you teach the Bible, come on over. And I always felt like the Lord was saying to me, even though there were some attractive offers, no, Jim, I brought you to the Church of God, and it's there that I want you to serve. And then I would talk to some of my brothers and sisters who are in other church families and hear about all the ways in which they have to defer to a larger office or something. And
right.
I think, oh, I'm glad I'm in the Church of God, so I get all that. But when you insert language in your deed to secure it, you don't lose any control of your property at all. And you don't have to give anybody's consent about anything. All it does is it puts conditions in the deed, and you're the master. You get to decide what the conditions are and to who will be the beneficiary. So you can do that, just like you're planning a will or an estate, to make sure that all of your sacrifice goes in the direction that you believed in when you denied yourself to help build that ministry. So what are the conditions? Well, normally the conditions are if the church leaves the Church of God, as we've discussed already, or if the church closes. Those are usually the two conditions, but you could add another condition. What if you're afraid that the Church of God will change its theology on A, B, C, or D? If you want to
Which
put
is
that
definitely one of the things I've also heard in conversations.
And so what if we surrender that? Because part of the secure deeding is once you put it in the deed, it can never be removed unless the beneficiary who's named allows it to be removed. So then you have to wonder, what if we put in the General Assembly of the Church of God, what if they change their position on something important to me? Well, you can make that a condition in your deed. Just say, this property, if we leave the Church of God or if it closes, will go to the General Assembly of the Church of God of the United States and Canada, or maybe it's to your local state association or to Children of Promise or any Church of God agency. You could choose from a menu. As long as they don't, and then you name your conditions. You are the master of how it's what it forms. So what are your concerns? You just have to know that once you put it in there, it can't be removed or changed unless the person or the organization, not the person, you can't give it to a person, but because that's nonprofit law in this country, but to the organization, once it's there, unless they give it back to you, it can't be changed. So you can think about that. But so there's that little bit of risk there, let's say. But on the other hand, what's the risk of not having a secure deed? Well, the risk is you can still lose everything. And that's to my point of illustration just now. In today's environment, we've had some very spectacular properties that were actually purchased and constructed with a loan from what used to be our church bank. The Board of Church Extension and Home Missions is no longer operating, but these properties were developed because people all around the movement were depositing together to create an engine of development through this banking system of the Board of Church Extension, may it rest in peace. And yet those properties were not securely deeded, and they just walked away. And you think, well, I can't have, my church is too big. No, because we had a pastor, as I said, a Church of God pastor who just got into some Reformed theology, and he began to believe that, you know what, this Church of God isn't all straight about everything, and he wasn't sure that women could preach, and once saved, always saved, a lot of things that the Church of God has never embraced. And consequently, he persuaded his board, and they just walked away with the whole thing. A church of hundreds and hundreds of people. So you see, the threat, the danger, the risks are real. And it's too late, once that's at the door, to fix it. So that's kind of the background. I have to tell you, who do you want to make the beneficiary? Let's say you choose to go down this. And I mean,
you're going to ask me who I wanted to make the beneficiary.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, but Justin, you know, your church has been through some options. I mean, your church is Indiana Ministries. I'm sure would be glad to be named as the single beneficiary. This office, Church of God Ministries, we have some churches that say, and Church of God Ministries is not Church of God Ministries like a standalone. We are the office of the General Assembly. So you're essentially saying, if we're named, you're giving it to the General Assembly of the Church of God as the beneficiary if you close or somebody tries to take it away. Or you could name both. Or you could name one of our universities. What school did you go to and graduate from?
Mid-America.
Mid-America, MacU in Oklahoma City.
Yes.
Are you a fan?
I am.
You felt like it was a good deal for you?
I did.
I mean, a church could have pastors and leaders who went to MacU and say, you know what, if something happens to this church, we want the assets to go to support the wonderful ministry at MacU. And you could say that about any four of our universities, and it'd all be legit. Or you could say we want it to be divided between all four of our schools. Or you could say Christian Women Connection or Servant Solutions to help provide retirement benefits to our pastors. I mean, anything that's a Church of God agency is fit, and you're the master. Nobody can tell you, well, you have to do it to the state. That's not valid, and the General Assembly has not approved that. The General Assembly actually spoke to this in a motion saying, every church should be encouraged to securely deed their property by naming any Church of God agency. And you can do that. You can name them all or one or two. But you're the master. Nobody can say you have to do it to the Church of God and the General Assembly through Church of God Ministries. Nobody can tell you have to do that. And nobody can tell you have to do it to MacU. You get to decide. But the purpose of it is to protect the asset for the Church of God. Which brings me to this little piece of paper. All right, what do I got
Looks like
here?
it's been around for a little bit.
Well, this is old. So what we've got here is from the Church of God. Where is that? Church of God in...
Ottumwa?
Ottumwa,
Is that how
Iowa.
you pronounce that? Okay.
Let's say hands up. Anyone been to Ottumwa? Well, it's a city in Iowa. And this document is their founding documents. And it's from 1918 when this congregation was established. And the congregation fell into hard times. And, that happens sometimes. And there were just 5 or 6 people left in the congregation. They had a pastor who called us up at our office and said, I think that the church is going to close. And there is one member of our remnant, a young man who grew up in the church as a child, and he's come back, and he's a good man. But he believes that all the assets should go to our local community because, as is sometimes said, it's clear that people who give money to a local church intend for that ministry to continue in that local area. Sometimes I've heard that said that it should go to the state where it is because it's clear if they gave money in the state of Nebraska that it should stay in Nebraska and so on. And this young man felt like, we're going to close and this is some valuable asset here. And we think that it should go and stay in our community, but not to the Church of God per se, because there weren't other Church of God options. So he had to devise a list of other charities that could be the beneficiary, but none of them were in the Church of God, and some of them were not necessarily even Christian charities. Because nonprofits that own property have to give it to another charitable organization. You can't give it to a person. Anyway, so this pastor was calling and saying, but I don't agree with that. He says, I think that the intent of the church from the beginning was that it would always go to the Church of God Anderson. Well, we didn't, we don't have any particularities in our office about that. We said, well, send us your documents and so on. So this is the document they sent to us from 1918. And the argument being made by this young man, again, a good man, was that, well, we hear what you're saying, Mr. Pastor, who's aged, and so on, but nobody is here alive. Nobody's alive who was there at the beginning of this church or could speak for the history of the church. Your argument that it should go to the Church of God is that it's not. It's just your idea. It's just speculative. And okay, but it says right here in the document that if this church ever closes, well, all of it goes to the Church of God in Anderson, Indiana. That's what it says. Well, but that's crazy. Those people are all dead. They're all gone. There's no children. There's no trace of them anymore from 1918.
Right.
So I hear that, and that's kind of a reasonable thing. You think, I kept the lights on the last few years. I mowed the grass. I get to decide. But the last will and testament of the people that gave birth to the church was otherwise. And so when I heard that nobody's alive and, you can't really tell, I just thought, well, I get that, but I'm reading through the document, and I'm going to hold this up. I don't know if you can see this on our camera. These are the signatures of the document from 1918. And one thing I noticed was that the pastor's name was Ella Miller. And that struck me because, Ella Miller, I know that name. My grandmother used to talk about her. And sure enough, right here on this list, right here, this guy, John E. Worthen, signed it. That's my grandfather. John E. Worthen's my mother's father. And my grandparents moved to Seattle, to Washington State. They went from 1904, they went out there, but back in 1918, they came back home to Ottumwa for a short time. My mother was actually born in Ottumwa, and they birthed the Church of God in Ottumwa before they returned back home to their new home out west. And during that time, my grandfather, John E. Worthen, signed the paperwork. So when the question came up, well, we don't know what those people wanted. We should be able to decide today. Nobody knows what they wanted. I finally had to stand up and say, well, I know exactly what they wanted. Because this guy, John E. Worthen, I know him. That's my grandfather. He died when I was 14. I used to live upstairs of his house. I had breakfast with him, oatmeal and brown sugar and milk every day in my growing up years. And I'll tell you what, John E. Worthen, he was devoted to the Church of God. He loved Ottumwa, he loved Iowa, he loved Washington State, he loved the United States, but more than anything, he loved the Church of God, which he considered to be a global movement. His purpose in this document, I know, was to guarantee that the asset would remain for the Church of God movement. He was alleged to the movement, not to a place, not to a community, not to a region, not even to a country. And I grew up in a church where my grandfather was a pillar in Seattle, and guess what? They're all about missions. And they sent missionaries to start the church in Egypt, to start the church in the Caribbean, and they have deep, deep roots for generations in that. And that church, my home church, is still alleged to that. And I promise you, their property is tied up for the movement because they had this global sense that they were part of something global. I'm just telling you, every local church, just to underscore, can make a decision. How can you learn more about this? we have a website. It's called jesusasthesubject.org. You got that? And then if you go // and do secure-deeding, there you'll read all about it, step by step, what you can do, how you can talk about it. And if you have any questions, you just follow back on that website, send us a note, and we'll help you navigate that to the place that your church wants to go. Not where we think you should go, but within the confines of the General Assembly's recommendations to something in the Church of God. We'll help you get there, I promise. And, well, if you need more help, just call us up. Okay, there's one other thing. Board of Church Extension. Ever heard of that?
I have.
What have you heard about it?
It's not been good.
What do you think it was?
Well, so they helped build churches,
Yep.
found churches.
Yep.
And then, I was pretty young when all the stuff started to fall apart. So, the last I really heard about it was that it went belly up and
That
a
unraveled.
lot of money was lost.
So the Board of Church Extension, just as you named, and as I referred to earlier, was a kind of like a bank for the Church of God. And it was started in the 1920s, and people were encouraged to put their money at the Church Extension, just like a bank. And some of the argument was, if you put your money in our bank at the church, we'll loan it out to build churches. Other banks will loan it out to build houses of ill repute, or all kinds of secular purposes. So the idea was, not only will you earn some interest on your deposits with us, but you can rest assured that your money is being turned over to expand the kingdom. That was the premise, and it worked from the 1920s all the way to the early 2000s. And during that time, hundreds and hundreds of our churches found financing and help financially and so on through the Board of Church Extension. Oh, but by the way, also, it was the Board of Church Extension and home missions. We sometimes forget it was also home missions. So urban ministry, Native American ministry, ministry to the Hispanic Concilio, ministry to some of our communities of color, anything that was a home mission was under the umbrella of this freestanding agency. So sometimes people would bequeath their assets to the Board of Church Extension because it was building the church.
Right.
And it also was building home missions. And all of that worked fine. And it's Board of Church Extension that actually invented this idea of conditionally deeded or secure deeding. And for all the years that Church Extension was in business, the movement would always name, not always, but almost always, people would securely deed their property, local churches, and name their Board of Church Extension. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes they would name a state association or the General Assembly or a university. That there are cases of that. But most often it was in the Board of Church Extension Home Missions name. But in the early 2000s, it did go under. And the federal government intervened, took it into receivership, and that became a big drama. Now, the original premise was a lot of people lost a lot of money. But over time, the federal courts managed it. They took it over, and they took it over about the year 2002. And that case did not close until August of 2015. Think about that. The world moved on, but actually the feds were still liquidating assets and trying to figure it all out, and they appointed people to manage it and so on. And it wasn't until August of 2015 that the federal court for the Southern District of Indiana, seated at Indianapolis, that's the venue, folded up the file. During that time of their stewardship of it, people had over 90% of their assets restored. In fact, a study was done. If you had put your money in the stock market for that same period of time, you would have had less return. You'd come out worse than if you'd had it there. That's not an argument for Board of Church Extension. I'm just saying the reality is the feared collapse of financial futures was not fully realized. Although in the early years, people could be really stressed because their money was there and they couldn't get it out and all that.
Yeah.
I'm not here to revisit all that sad history. Just want you to know that we have many churches that may have this in their deeds and they don't even know it, and nobody knows they're there. It's important that every local church check your own deed, because people would securely deed their church property to Church Extension, but they wouldn't tell Church Extension. And Church Extension doesn't have records of the ones that were found. And so we're always now trying to clean that up, because when the court closed the file, it said, here's what's going to happen. For all these unrealized secure deeds, the things that are not in force now because the conditions haven't been triggered, church is still alive, it's not left the movement. In the future, Church of God Ministries Incorporated, the General Assembly of the Church of God, will be the steward of those things. So we inherited that, not by our ask, but it just came on us. And sometimes people think, well, there's a cash cow, all those churches that might move away or cash in, and truth be told, it's a mixed bag because a lot of properties are derelict, it costs us money out the door for which we can't recover. We're legally obligated to take care of it, although some cases come through. And we ask the General Assembly for a directive, because we're the Office of the General Assembly. How would you like us to handle those cases? And in 2019, after an exhaustive study for several years, the Assembly overwhelmingly approved a motion that said, what happens is, if a church deed comes up and the conditions are triggered, Church of God Ministries will then receive the ownership of that. They'll talk to the local state association or the regional jurisdiction, and they'll say, do you have a plan for this? Do you want to have a church plant? What would you want? They could say, yes, we do. We want to put a church there, or no, we don't. But we work with those local authorities, but often they don't have another option, and they'll say, you'll just have to dispose of it. And the Assembly said, then we will dispose of it. And after the costs are subtracted of that disposal, because there's always some costs involved,
Absolutely.
then we split the net proceeds, half, 50-50, with the regional association, and we at the General Assembly have the other half. Now, there are not a lot of cases like that. I'm sorry, I should have looked up the number, but in all these years from 2015 till now, I don't know if there's 10 or 12 cases. It's not a huge number, but that's the way it goes. And I'm saying this to say there's really three categories of churches right now. There are churches that have these Board of Church Extension clauses in their deeds. If you do nothing about it, your property is still secured. But it means that it'll go this way. If you close or you try and leave the movement, like the church I was just talking about, where they're merging and trying to move into the Assembly of God, the pastor wants to, let's say, what would happen is that property would come to us. We would talk to the local state authorities, Church of God authorities in that state. What do you want to do with the property and so on? And ultimately, if it's sold, we would take care of that, and then we'll split the proceeds with that local regional association 50-50. That's how it will go down. So if you have that in your deed, well, you can do that. But it's really important that you figure out if it's there, because we've had a lot of cases where people didn't think it was there. And then when they tried to sell or something happened, then a title search is done and they realize, oh my goodness, we can't.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're in trouble. And actually, I'm working hours, I and some of my team, on a case in another state that merged with another denomination, and they changed their deed, and now they've discovered that it was actually securely deeded to the Church of God. Now all that has to be unraveled, and it's a long, long story. If you have that in your deed right now, though, your congregation is securely deeded. Now, we have another class of churches. These are ones that understood they had a BCE, Board of Church Extension clause, and they made the decision to try and update it and name somebody else, because the BCE is not still existing, and they weren't really comfortable with the General Assembly's protocols for the sale, or they just wanted to update it. And so they've changed it. And if you come to us, because we're now the legal authority, and say we want to change that, we will accommodate that. And sometimes they'll name their state, or they'll name MACU, or they'll name Church of God Ministries, or they'll name all three. Again, you get to decide. So that's a second category. They've already done the work. They've cleaned it up. But the largest category are those churches that have not now and never had secure deeding. And for you, we're just here to say, think about it. Go to the website, jesusisasubject.org/secure-deeding. And when you do that, a whole portal will come up that'll tell you about the background and so on. And step 1, 2, 3, and again, it's a place where you can ask questions and reach out to us. We're so glad to help you. Bottom line, we all want to see the Church of God advance and prosper. We want to see it stronger, and we don't want to see it losing things. The people have worked hard over generations to collect and to invest for the work of this movement. Thanks for thinking about it. All right, I've been going on, Justin. Thanks for coming and letting me do that, but we're going to take some questions now. Just jump on in.
Okay.
Let's see. What do we got here? On the top, we have a question. Indiana Ministries recently made some decisions regarding credentialing of their ministers that I am uncomfortable with. What is the national office doing to address this?
Well, your national ministries. Don't look at
Come on,
me.
Justin. Help me out here.
You want me to tell you what I think you should do? Or
Well, yeah, at this stage, I think.
I'm not wading into that.
Well, what are we doing to address this so that people can understand? The Church of God is organized just as we are sometimes with some elastic in our local churches about membership in the way that many other church groups are not. When it comes to our national church life or the broader Church of God, we really have a lot of elastic. So I work at Church of God Ministries, which is the office of the General Assembly. I don't have the capacity to do things that they do not authorize. I can't assume power or make changes in our theology or decide that once saved, always saved. That's beyond my pay grade. We are responsive to and effect the will of the General Assembly. Now, under that umbrella, and I say an umbrella is just kind of a general term, it's not really authoritative umbrella. There are 49 other separate jurisdictions, often called regional associations. Like Indiana Ministries is one of those 49 regional associations. Often these associations are defined by a state boundary. Indiana Ministries defines its scope of influence and responsibility that is commensurate with the state lines of Indiana. Now, we have some associations that transcend state. So for instance, there's something out west called the Pacific Northwest Association.
Right.
That's Washington State, except for Southwest Washington, which belongs to Oregon, and parts of Idaho, which are in Washington, I mean, all those kinds of things. Then you have some states like California, it's so large that they have 3 different regional associations. There's a Northern California, a Central California, and Southern California, Central and Southern. And then Southern California includes Southern Nevada, and Northern California includes Northern Nevada and Hawaii, and Guam. I mean, but generally, these jurisdictions reflect state boundaries or kind of contiguous regions. Each of these is wholly autonomous. And so they decide what to do on their own. And many times people ask me, why don't you fix this or why do you fix that? Well, I can't fix it because of the way we're structured. Of course, I can talk to people and I can have good conversations, and I have many friends who work in these state associations or these regional associations, but they don't report to me. I don't have any voice in who they are or how they're chosen or what their skill set should be or what their ambition should be. I'm not able to influence that. So to the question at hand, Indiana Ministries, what's the national office doing to address this? Well, Indiana Ministries, like all of the jurisdictions, is tasked to bring credentialing to the fore. This is a kind of complicated, long answer, but the General Assembly is the owner of the credentialing process, and it has mandated that we in our office stand up leadership focus and that we support it and empower it and make it available across the movement. And we are the owner of Leadership Focus. But the credentialing process, if you want to be a candidate into Leadership Focus, you have to get the permission of your local jurisdiction's approval to be a candidate level for Leadership Focus. I can't get you into Leadership Focus from my office. If you live in Indiana, they have to let you in. And at the same time, when you get through Leadership Focus, if you're going to be ordained or licensed, we don't do that. The local state does that. And so we don't have control over that. Sometimes people will call me up or call my office up and say, hey, I went through Leadership Focus, I did all the work, I got all the passing grades, and I can't get ordained because there's some hiccup in my local state. Why don't you fix that? Well, because I and Lori Fast, who leads Leadership Focus, and Huddle Smith, who works with the United States and Canada Department of our office and all that, we don't have authority to make anybody do anything on those levels. What is the national office doing to address this? That particular question about this particular scenario, I'm not in the weeds on it, but here's the deal. If you have a question about it and you're in Indiana, you need to address it to Indiana Ministries. And here's the other piece of the process that you need to know. So when it comes to credentialing, there are a couple pieces, the security of credentials and the maintenance of them. And those are defined through the mandate of Leadership Focus in terms of the teaching instrument, the preparation path, and we do have leverage over that. And then there is the credentials manual. And that is what Indiana Ministries is working when this question about regarding credentialing and so on, they're backing up to the manual. What does the manual say? And the manual also has been adopted by the General Assembly, and it has been mandated as this is our book. It's probably the closest thing we have in the Church of God to a statement of our doctrine and practice, even though it's designed for credentials only. It could be applied, the truths there that are upheld and so on, and reflect the movement. And if you have a problem, let's say your credentials are challenged and you don't think they should be, well, Now, this was not always true, but now there's an appeal process. And it's not to my office, it's to one of the standing committees of the General Assembly. It's called the Committee on Credentials. And that's a group of 17 persons chosen by the General Assembly. And in fairness, one of them is not chosen by the Assembly. The chair is appointed by the General Director. So I make that appointment, but the other 16 come through this process of the GA. And those people sit, and they're the ones who are authorized to take an appeal. So if you feel like something's being done that's untoward or is out of line, or you have a question about it, this could be true especially for your own credentials. Let's say someone came to you, Justin, and said, we're not liking the way you skateboard, and whatever it is.
I don't like the way I skateboard either.
There's nobody that likes your skateboard.
That's fair.
Out of the blue. But I'm just saying, if that happened and you say, that's not right, and you went to the Indiana Ministries Credentials Committee and you said, this is not fair, I should be able to skateboard the way I want to, and they say, drop dead, then unlikely they would say it quite that way, but then your course is to appeal to the Committee on Credentials. It's a little bit like a Supreme Court appeal. Now, what the COC, we call it shorthand, what it'll do, I can't say. And again, that committee is not controlled by me. There's some things I wish they would do differently. I've asked them for some things, and they said, oh, not right now. Because it's an independent committee of the Assembly. It's only accountable to the Assembly. It's not accountable to the Ministries Council. It's not accountable to the chair of the Assembly. It is a standing committee elected and chosen by the Assembly. And it has been enfranchised by the Assembly to be the last stop on the credentialing questions. So what are we doing about it? I would say, if something comes to me, I will steer people into that path. What's that next question?
Well, and I appreciated that you did say something in there, and I don't know who asked the question. They may have may have absolutely done this.
Yeah.
But the first step you said there was talk to Indiana Ministries.
Yep.
And so I hope that we always start there.
That's right.
Or whatever state it might be. Talk to them first and then go to the COC.
And in our last town hall, I was trying to reflect on, before you jump onto Facebook or into some social media with a screed or a judgment or, lobbing any grenades, talk to your brother or sister in Christ first.
Yes.
And hear their heart. And then follow a process of remedy and resolution through those steps. Ultimately, the General Assembly is I say the COC is the last stop.
Yeah.
The General Assembly is the thing that is I should call it the seminal forum of resolution on those kinds of things. All right, there's another question coming up there. What do you think it says?
You want me to read it?
Yeah.
I consider myself JOG through and through. I find great joy being part of this movement. But as a credentialed minister, I find myself out of alignment with my state assembly. What do I do?
So that question it kind of speaks to what we've just been talking about here too. Mm-hmm. The way we're organized and the way we have practiced our structure is that you are accountable to the jurisdiction where you are resident. And again, that's almost always a geography. There are just a couple exceptions to that. There's a group out west called the Interstate Association, comprised of largely African American churches, which historically has done its own credentialing. Okay. It's one of those 49. Okay. Sometimes people have heard of the West Middlesex Camp Meeting in Western Pennsylvania. That's the National Association of the Church of God. It does not do its own credentialing. But the Interstate Association has a camp meeting at a place called Hanford, California. It's kind of an out west expression of that same ministry model, and they are a regional association. So I'm just saying the Interstate Association has credentialing credentialed churches and pastors throughout western states, generally west of the Rocky Mountains. But except for that, most of these jurisdictions are all kind of on the ground geography, and where you are resident is where you are accountable. That's the way our system is set up. So what do I do if I'm out of alignment with my local jurisdiction, my state association or my regional association? Well, again, you have to go to the leadership there and work your concerns through their systems. Maybe that's a credentialing committee. Maybe that's a regional pastor. Not all of our states employ people to work and serve with them. Some do, some don't, but there's a chair of the assembly or something. Ultimately, every one of our regional assemblies, our regional jurisdictions has an assembly. They're all kind of replicas of the of the original, which is there's a General Assembly. This is where every pastor, credentialed, and some lay delegates, in most cases, can have voice. And that becomes your process of appeal or of navigation. I've sometimes had been frustrated by some of the ways in which some of our regional associations and jurisdictions would respond to certain questions, and I sometimes find myself in the crosshairs of that. And I've been an advocate for actually combining some of these things, or if not combining the jurisdictions, but I think we should think about how our credential committee might be in some instances, not always, maybe could work better if they were a little bit broader based, because some of our regional jurisdictions have such small portfolios, small numbers of people, that they're not always able to process and stand up the necessary credentialing structures. And man, if they would join with some other people in the neighborhood, some other neighboring states, you'd have a more robust and probably a more, what should we say, thoughtful process, because you'd just be able to draw from a larger pool of anointed folk. All that to say, what do I do? Well, you have to start in your local jurisdiction and work your way up through there. And ultimately, if it's a credentialed thing about you, I mean, when it says I'm out of alignment, that might have to do with I don't like the focus of my regional assembly. I don't like that they're talking about this or that. Or it might be I don't like the way they're managing credentials. I'm not sure what the exact thing is, but...
Well, I think part of the question would be, is the state assembly out of alignment with the Church of God?
Well, that's another thing.
Because that's a whole,
What happens? That's a whole
different
thing.
realm of possibility there.
And part of my great challenge is trying to find alignment in this movement, because so many of our regional jurisdictions and so many of our local churches thrive in their autonomy.
Right.
And as a movement needs to have a more, probably, shall we say, a more grounded and unified approach to actually advancing the kingdom. And we have a lot of different people with different ideas who want to pursue their ideas. And
I think every local pastor understands that feeling. It's just multiplied.
Right. Been there, done that. and so maybe that's a little apart from the question. Let's see what's the next question up. Has Church of God Ministries been in contact with Indiana Ministries regarding them challenging the credentialing process? Maybe this is referring to the same stream of thought in the first question. Have we, in my office, been in contact with Indiana Ministries regarding the way in which they're challenging the credentials, credentialing process, or have we been challenging their management of credentials? No, I don't think so. Again, Indiana Ministries is a very, what shall we say? It's a strong office relative to some of our other states and so on, and generally self-sufficient. And I don't receive. I'm not sure I've received any questions from Indiana Ministries in my tenure about anything. So I'm not at the table helping decide what they do or how they do it. If they ask or invite me into conversation, I certainly would be. But it's another kind of sensitive thing where each of our jurisdictions, and I know people at Indiana Ministries, I love them and respect them. But I'm just saying how to interact. Now, I will say I've had some members of my staff who have been down the street, it's down the interstate to the offices of Indiana Ministries, to talk about some congregational issues, but I'm not familiar with any issues with credentialing. I'll back up, because I went myself and asked about some people I proposed for leadership focus that they did not consider to be qualified to enter, so they couldn't get into Indiana Ministries, and they were people that I felt did have merit. So I'll say that's been some years ago. I did go down there and have that conversation, and I was not persuasive. So the short answer is no, not sure. If whatever the issues are, whatever the context is, I don't know everything about everything, but I don't believe we've had any intersection with them about the credentialing process. Next up. Justin.
How can we better train young people to listen for God's calling and affirm and support them? As a youth pastor of 12 years, I'm getting to be a part of the IYC team and everything.
International Youth Convention.
International Youth Convention, yes, sorry.
Yep, right.
I would say first off, and Adam's going to love this, send
Adam
your
Trent,
students,
absolutely.
Adam Rentis,
That, yeah.
man, I'm really bad at that. Send all of your students to International Youth Convention. There's your plug. No, seriously though, I've actually recently been working with our students a lot more lately, which has been incredible to be able to do. And it's been a great reminder to me, after being in lead ministry for several years, how important those one-on-one conversations are. If you're able to have them. Obviously, sometimes you can't. But I'm thinking of one student in particular that lately has really shown an affinity for, he may be called into ministry. He's been teaching in the schools, taking his Bible to school and reading it at school. Kid who a year ago wasn't doing any of this. And from what I'm told anyway, in conversations I've had, a lot of it came down to conversations, just interactions with one-on-one, and seeing that and begin to pull it out of them as you see it. I think it's important to remind them that that is a possibility out there too, because they don't hear about going into ministry at career day.
Yes.
Right. And truthfully, a lot of times if they hear about going into ministry, it's all how bad it is and how hard it is and how little you get paid.
I'm for it. I so subscribe to what you're saying, Justin, because of my own journey. Of course, I'm an old guy now, but I was young once, back at the dawn of time, and I would never be in the ministry if there were not people in my church who saw something in me that I did not see. They called it out of me. I was planning to go into government. I went to law school. I had no ambition to be in the ministry. In fact, that was the last thing on my radar. But there were people in my local church that were intentional about saying, Jim, the Lord's hand is on you. Think about this. And there is no substitute for that. I think we all want an easy fix. We want to have some program. If we could just pull a book off the shelf, if somebody could just create another avenue to create something, when actually every pastor, every shepherd should be looking around the room. Who are the people in their parish that the Lord may be calling up? Every person, you don't have to be a pastor. You're looking around and you're thinking, who is it? And to take the boldness and say, have you thought about this? You don't have to command anyone to do anything. You just have to invite them to consider it. And there's one other thing I want to say. Pastors need to be positive people. And I haven't always lived up to that, but man, I more often than not, try to present the ministry in a positive way.
Absolutely.
Because when I was a young guy, one reason I never thought about it was because I had my pastor, I respected immensely. He was terrific. And I had several great pastors in my formative years. But in the main, I often heard pastors complaining about things. And I thought, man, I don't want to grow up and be like that.
Yeah.
Man, and Justin, that's part of the reason why I'm so glad to have you in this room, because Justin, you're a young guy. I am old enough to be your father. And here you are, a generation who is a positive presence. You have strong ideas, you have deep convictions, I know you do. But man, there are people who are just underneath you, below you, some maybe in high school are going to look at Justin Brown and say, that guy, yes, I would like to be like that. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. How do we affirm and support them? You mentioned IYC, let's just say that.
Yes.
That's something you should go to. I'm so old, I have a granddaughter. She's so pumped because this year she's going to the IYC for the first time. She's 15 years old and she is so ready to go. And I'm just saying, if you're a grandparent, if you're a parent, if you just see somebody in your church, think about the International Youth Convention. And if you don't have any other kids in the church that are going, network in your regional association, call up your regional office and say, hey, I've got somebody that wants to go. Can they hook up with your group or another group? But that's one great thing. There's something else I know you know about called the Intern Academy.
Yes.
How does that encourage?
So Intern Academy, for those who don't know what it is, it brings in especially students who are already in college and heading into ministry, but younger than that even, and just kind of sets them up with here's a youth pastor, here's a pastor, here's a worship pastor. It's not just youth ministry that you get to work alongside and you get to learn from them. And I know from my personal experience, I wasn't in Intern Academy when I was growing up because it didn't exist yet. I predate. I am at least that old. But it was walking alongside my youth pastor that really affirmed for me that youth ministry is where I was going to start out. Yep. I knew probably someday that would change, but man, the beginning, and we had some interns in Intern Academy that came in and they worked with us and they realized youth ministry isn't for us. In fact, I think I'm actually supposed to be in care ministry or senior ministry or whatever. But it was through walking alongside it that they began to realize those things. And Intern Academy is a great resource for that.
It's a mentoring opportunity. It's It's a clarifying opportunity. It's a practicum opportunity. It's a laboratory. It is terrific. And so think about Intern Academy. And if you're not sure how to get in touch with it, again, let us know. We'll build you a bridge to the terrific
I
team.
almost wore my Intern Academy shirt
There
today.
you go. There you go. There's some other programs like Trellis, which is a program designed to help people get through university and to scholarship them through university, while at the same time providing intern opportunities while they're at university. And that's a terrific program. We can help bridge you to that too. And our universities also are places that work on this. And don't ever underestimate, back to MacU where you went. I mean, MacU has a terrific program for people thinking about ministry and interning as students along the way. Many of our schools have things like this. You're the MacU guy. I have 4 sons that went to Anderson University, and one of them's a pastor. And you know that guy, Nathaniel Lyon.
I do.
And I'm just saying, these are ways to affirm and support a new generation of leaders. Don't be discouraged because they're out there. But it's going to require, back to the earlier conversation we had on this question, it's going to require all of us to have our eyes open and looking for those young men and women, and maybe even a little bit older young men and women who may be already in a career trajectory, but the Lord's hand is on them to be in the ministry. It's about us calling out of them. Don't wait for somebody in Anderson or somebody in your regional jurisdiction office or somebody else to do the job. It's going to take all of us.
I think of Jesus saying that, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few.
That's right.
It's easy to look at any generation, now that I have a few below me, and look and go back, man, there's just no hope. But no, the harvest is plentiful.
They're there.
They're there.
They're absolutely there. And they may not even know that they're part of that harvest, but you need to help them see it, and God will honor that. I just know it's true. I'll just say this. I met Justin because he's one of the group I call the Young Turks, and I became acquainted with Justin because I started to see, as I was in my job going around, I see people that, man, this person has potential, both men and women. And I've had several cohorts of these Young Turks, which we just kind of developed relationships, but it's not really, it's not a teaching course. It's just the developing relationship. And all of us have that capacity who may be down the road a little bit. Think about that. Who are you reaching out to help? All right, next up. In regards to unity, if a pastor preaches things that are not biblical and does not acknowledge this when talked with, how would you suggest handling this, especially if others in the congregation don't care? If a pastor is preaching things that are not biblical and does not acknowledge this. So first scenario is the pastor is preaching,
And
he's outside of the scripture somehow, and doesn't acknowledge that he's walking away from the scripture. And when he's confronted with it, or when someone's raises it and you talk with him and he's just like, no, you're off base. How do you handle this, especially if others in the congregation don't care? Well, when we say preaches things that are not biblical, I mean that's an important phrase, because the pastor may in fact think that he's very biblically grounded. He may just have an exegesis, an interpretation that differs from your own. This is why belonging to a movement matters. It's why credentialing matters, and so on, because we all know that there are people who use the scripture or read the scripture in a variety of ways. And we have, in the Church of God, a hermeneutic, a certain way of understanding important ideas. Let's take women in ministry, for instance. That's been a part of our theology from the beginning, that women have equal access to ministry just like men do, and that we are in a scheme of gender equity, egalitarian. We're not saying women have value before God, but there are just certain things they can't do. We believe that they can have place in ministry. So there's a theology. That's a hermeneutic. That's a way of looking at the scripture. Let's use that as an exception. What if we had a pastor who is saying, no way, women cannot be in ministry, I'm not buying it. They're in the Church of God.
Which I've heard Church of God pastors say that thing.
And we have actually more and more of that going on as people from, we're come-outers, come on out of those other groups that come to us. Well, some people are actually doing that, but they're bringing with them other sets of ideas. And when they do that, then they think they're standing in the scripture. What do you do if they're out of sync with the stream of theology of the Church of God. And this is a sticky wicket on many fronts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because some people are all ready to lower the boom on that one, but they don't see why the boom should be lowered on somebody else on a different point. But unity requires us to come around some core ideas and stand by them. What do you do? How do you handle it if the pastor is not open to your entreaty and others in the congregation don't care? Well, that's really difficult because the congregation, that's the strength and weakness, the local congregation is in command of its own destiny. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a congregation that does not share your concerns, they don't care, then that's problematic because you have a choice. How do I help and persuade and move my congregation into a more congruent theology about the Scripture? And I'm just assuming in the Church of God sense. How do you do that? By patiently and lovingly helping to teach and talk with. There's so many gradations of this. Some things would just be intolerable. I couldn't be in a church that would deny the divinity of Christ. They could say that Jesus is a great guy and smart and all that, but he's not the only way. I mean, that for me is a deal breaker. On the other hand, there are some things I might ride with because they believe in the tribulation at the end of time, and how do I navigate something like that may be outside of my own understanding of the Scripture, second coming theology, eschatology. So it's hard to answer universally on every point here, but you have to make a decision where God has called you to be, and you have to pray that through. And did God call you to be a part of that church? And if so, well then, you'll have to thread that needle. At the last, if there's a credentialing issue, again...
That's what I was going to ask. At what point would you say, contact the state?
You have to kind of say, you need to know this person is preaching that Jesus is not Lord. Or he wants us to go in a different direction. That's what the Church of God would do.
Right.
And that's why we have a credentialing team, and that's why we have to be able to maintain some sort of unity in our holiness. Even holiness, we talk about that. What does it mean, and so on. We have a certain sense of what that means, and we need to live within that and help persuade lovingly those around us to get there. Oh, there's so much we could unpack, but the hour's gone, Justin.
It is.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks
Always
for
proud to
inviting
be in
me.
the room with you.
I looked at this as an opportunity to just sit in the room and learn from you, Jim.
Oh, well.
Really.
Oh, come on.
Really. I mean, if I could add anything, that's great, but mostly it was just a pleasure to be able to learn.
You make every room better, Justin. Seriously, thanks for your work. Thanks for the ministry at Monroe City. May the Lord bless there. And we thank you also for joining us. And while I realize sometimes these town halls can be frustrating because the whole question is unpacked, or maybe you aren't satisfied with an answer, but thank you for tuning in, and just know we're always glad to hear from you, especially when you speak kindly and graciously and not necessarily venting on Facebook, but actually reach out to talk to us. I have a lot of meetings after every town hall on Zoom with people who say, I heard you say this on Zoom, and I've got some questions about that. Oh man, that is so appropriate. That is so
Absolutely.
welcome. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in. May the Lord be with you this evening. Again, we're in Eastern time, so we're pushing 8:30 in the evening. But if you're out west, or you may not realize that
Enjoy dinner.
we have churches in 6 different time zones between the East Coast and Hawaii. So wherever you are, if the sun's still shining, enjoy. God bless.